There exists a profound paradox in human nature that separates the powerful from the powerless, the untouchable from the vulnerable, the master from the servant. This paradox whispers through the corridors of history, evident in the lives of those who commanded empires and shaped civilizations, yet it remains virtually invisible to the masses who shuffle through existence as victims of their own emotional turbulence. The secret that fortress walls cannot guard and weapons cannot protect is simpler and yet infinitely more complex than we dare to imagine. Those who master their emotions master their destiny. This is not merely a philosophical abstraction or motivational platitude, it is the raw, unvarnished truth upon which all genuine power rests. The ancient strategists understood this principle long before modern psychology attempted to quantify and categorize human behavior. Niccolò Machiavelli, often vilified and misunderstood, recognized that power is not derived from the magnitude of one's sword or the breadth of one's territory, but rather from the unwavering control of one's inner world. A man who can be moved by fear, paralyzed by doubt, or driven to irrational action by wounded pride has already surrendered his sovereignty to something far more terrifying than any external enemy. He has enslaved himself to the chaos of his own psychology. This exploration ventures into the realm of emotional mastery as the foundation of personal power. It traverses the landscape of what it truly means to destroy the weak self, not through violence or suppression, but through conscious transformation and the deliberate reconstruction of one's psychological architecture. The weak self is not evil, it is simply unprepared for the demands of genuine power. It is reactive rather than proactive, victimized by circumstance rather than author of its own narrative, and bound by attachments that render it perpetually vulnerable. Part 1: The Architecture of Vulnerability and the Foundation of Power. To understand the mechanism by which emotional mastery becomes power, one must first examine the structure of human vulnerability with clinical precision. Every person carries within them a constellation of emotional weaknesses, inherited from childhood traumas, social conditioning, genetic predispositions, and accumulated experiences of shame and humiliation. These weaknesses are not shameful, they are human. However, they become dangerous only when they remain unexamined and unconquered. They transform into pressure points that any adversary, competitor, or even circumstance can exploit. Consider the man driven by the need for approval. His entire existence becomes an elaborate performance designed to please others, to secure validation, to be loved or at minimum accepted by those around him. What appears as agreeableness and social grace is actually a carefully constructed prison. His decisions are not his own, they are dictated by the anticipated reactions of others. His choices are constrained by the invisible chains of social fear. When someone withdraws approval or criticism is leveled against him, his entire psychological foundation trembles. He becomes malleable, desperate, willing to compromise his principles to restore the approval he requires as desperately as a man dying of thirst requires water. This man is not merely vulnerable, he is conquered. His conqueror does not need weapons or direct confrontation. The conqueror need only understand what the man desires and, then, use that desire as leverage. This is not unique to approval-seeking individuals, it applies equally to those enslaved by fear, shame, pride, jealousy, lust, or any emotional state that exerts control over rational decision-making. The man who experiences uncontrolled rage is similarly enslaved. When anger erupts, his faculties surrender to this force. He cannot think strategically, he can only react explosively. His enemies learn to trigger this rage precisely because they understand that when a man is consumed by anger, he becomes predictable, vulnerable, and incapable of rational action. History is littered with powerful men who were destroyed not by equal military or political forces, but by enemies who simply knew which buttons to press to activate their uncontrolled emotional responses. The woman or man who is controlled by romantic love or sexual desire faces a parallel predicament. The emotional intensity of desire clouds judgment and creates tunnel vision. A person in the grips of passionate attachment becomes willing to surrender principles, compromise safety, and make decisions that contradict their own interests. Cleopatra understood this principle so thoroughly that she wielded it as a weapon, but many others have fallen victim to it precisely because they did not recognize it in themselves. Fear operates as perhaps the most insidious emotional master. A man controlled by fear of rejection, of failure, of loss, of death has already surrendered his freedom before battle commences. Fear constricts, paralyzes, distorts perception, and prevents the clear seeing necessary for power. The fearful man makes decisions based on avoidance rather than attraction towards something greater. His life becomes smaller and more constrained with each capitulation to fear. The Machiavellian understanding of power begins with this recognition: those who can be moved by emotional forces remain subordinate to those forces and, by extension, to those who understand how to activate or manipulate them. A person's emotional weakness becomes a handle by which they can be gripped, moved, and directed. It is the ultimate vulnerability, more exposing than physical nakedness, more dangerous than any tactical disadvantage. The question that separates the powerful from the powerless is not whether emotions will arise; they arise inevitably in all humans, but whether one will be mastered by them or will master them. This mastery is not about becoming cold or inhuman, it is about developing what might be called emotional sophistication. It is the difference between a musician who is overwhelmed by his instrument and a virtuoso who commands it to produce exactly the sounds he desires. Throughout history, those who accumulated genuine power recognized this principle instinctively. They were not necessarily the kindest or the most morally upright; they were often ruthless, calculating, and willing to do what others would not. But beneath their ruthlessness lay a bedrock of emotional control. They could observe their own emotions without being swept away by them. They could feel fear and act anyway. They could experience disappointment and adjust course without dissolving into despair. They could encounter rage and choose whether to express it or suppress it, understanding the strategic implications of each choice. This is the power that Machiavelli sought to illuminate: not cruelty for its own sake, but the willingness to act according to what circumstances demand rather than what emotions suggest. The Machiavellian prince was not necessarily a villain; he was someone who refused to be a victim of his own nature. He made decisions based on calculation rather than inclination, on strategy rather than sentiment. The foundation of this power lies in understanding that the self is not monolithic. Within each person exist multiple selves: the impulsive self, the fearful self, the needy self, the vengeful self, the lustful self, alongside the rational self, the disciplined self, the strategic self, the courageous self. The weak individual is dominated by his emotional selves, jerked about by whichever impulse happens to be activated in a given moment. The powerful individual has established sovereignty over his selves. He can call upon any of them as circumstances require, but none can seize control without his permission. This is why the destruction of the weak self is not a gentle or comfortable process. The weak self must be confronted, exposed, and systematically weakened through repeated acts of refusal. Every time a person chooses discipline over comfort, honesty over flattery, strategic silence over reactive expression, courage over fear, they are chipping away at the foundation of the weak self. They are starving it of the energy and attention it requires to maintain dominion. The alternative is continuation of the default human condition: a life lived in reaction to circumstances, to other people's expectations, and to emotional impulses that feel like they emerge from outside the self, as if one is a puppet suspended by strings one cannot see. In this condition, genuine power is impossible. One remains perpetually subject, perpetually vulnerable, perpetually limited by forces beyond conscious control. Part 2: The demolition of the weak self and the reconstruction of power. The process of destroying the weak self is neither metaphorical nor mystical, though it possesses an almost spiritual quality when undertaken with complete commitment. It is a deliberate, systematic campaign waged against one's own tendencies, habits, conditioned responses, and emotional automaticity. This is the war most worth fighting because its battlefield is internal and its victory brings liberation more profound than any external conquest. The weak self reveals itself most clearly in moments of emotional distress. It is the voice that urges capitulation when courage is required. It is the impulse toward self-protection that closes opportunities for growth. It is the sensitivity to slight and rejection that causes a person to contract and become smaller. It whispers that failure is unacceptable, that humiliation is unbearable, that rejection will be fatal. Most dangerously, it attempts to convince a person that these emotional responses are legitimate and unchangeable aspects of their fundamental nature rather than acquired patterns that can be systematically dismantled. The destruction begins with unflinching observation. A person must become a scientist of their own psychology, tracking patterns of emotional reactivity with the detached curiosity of a researcher studying specimens. When does anxiety arise? What specific trigger activates it? What is the narrative attached to it? When does anger surge? What belief system underlies this anger? When does shame manifest? What unexamined rule or standard is being violated? This observation cannot be conducted in a state of judgment or self-condemnation. The weak self must be examined the way one might examine a wound, with the intention not to blame the wound for existing but to understand its nature in order to heal it. As the weak self becomes clearly visible, the actual work of demolition can commence. This work takes specific forms, and each represents a direct assault on the patterns that maintain the weak self's dominion. The first form is the cultivation of discomfort. The weak self thrives in patterns of comfort, familiarity, and the avoidance of pain. It has learned certain strategies for getting through life with minimal friction and maximum pleasure, and it clings to these strategies with desperate intensity. The powerful person, conversely, develops the capacity to embrace discomfort as a teacher and tool. This is why those who systematically pursue physical discipline through weight training, cold exposure, distance running, or martial arts often find that their emotional resilience increases proportionally. The body and mind are connected. A person who will not flee from physical discomfort develops corresponding resistance to psychological discomfort. But, more directly, the weak self must be starved of the comforts upon which it depends. If a person habitually escapes difficult emotions through entertainment, they must deliberately withdraw this escape for periods of time, sitting instead with the discomfort and observing what arises. If they habitually seek approval through people-pleasing, they must practice saying no, tolerating the discomfort of disapproval, and continuing with their chosen course anyway. If they habitually soothe shame through false narratives about themselves, they must look directly at the shame, acknowledge it, and refuse the salve of self-deception. Each time they do this, the weak self weakens. It loses one of its tools for self-protection. It must develop resilience or suffer the consequences. The second form is the systematic exposure to situations that trigger the weak self and the practice of responding contrary to its impulses. A man afraid of rejection must place himself repeatedly in situations where rejection is possible and learn to survive it. A woman prone to shame must speak her truth, reveal her vulnerabilities, and discover that exposure does not annihilate her. A person inclined toward explosive anger must learn to pause, breathe, and respond rather than react, and they must do this thousands of times until the new pattern becomes automatic. This is not exposure therapy in the therapeutic sense, it is deliberate provocation of one's weak self for the purpose of demonstrating to oneself that it can be overridden. The third form is the deliberate cultivation of indifference to the emotional outcomes the weak self fears. This is perhaps the most subtle and most powerful tool of transformation. The weak self maintains its power partly through the intensity of emotion it generates. Shame feels real and overwhelming, rejection feels like a verdict of unworthiness, failure feels like confirmation of uselessness. But, the power of these emotions depends entirely on one's internal agreement that they matter. A person who has decided that the judgment of others is not ultimately relevant to their worth cannot be destroyed by rejection. A person who has decided that failure is information rather than verdict cannot be paralyzed by it. This indifference is not indifference to consequences that would be foolish. It is indifference to the emotional experience itself, to the story the weak self constructs around outcomes. A person can recognize that an action resulted in failure, acknowledge the practical implications, and adjust course, all without experiencing the shame and self-condemnation that the weak self tries to impose. They can be alone and not experience the existential terror the weak self attaches to solitude. They can be criticized and not experience it as an attack on their essence. How does one cultivate this indifference? Through repetition, through philosophy, through the constant practice of reinterpreting events. When the weak self whispers that rejection means unworthiness, the powerful person counters with clarity, rejection is simply information that this particular person or situation is not aligned with me. It is not a referendum on my value. When the weak self insists that failure is catastrophic, the powerful person responds, failure is how learning occurs. It is data. It is feedback. It is not my identity. The fourth form is the development of what might be called internal authority. As long as a person depends on external validation, external permission, external approval, the weak self retains dominion. It keeps a person in a perpetual state of seeking, of deference, of self-diminishment. The destruction of the weak self requires the establishment of an internal authority that does not require external confirmation. This is why solitude becomes such a powerful tool. It forces a person to become their own source of judgment, their own source of validation, their own source of meaning. In solitude, unfaced by the distractions and demands of social interaction, a person confronts themselves directly. They discover what they actually believe when no one is watching. They learn whether they can make decisions based on internal conviction rather than external pressure. They face the possibility that they might be fundamentally alone, without the constant social validation that masks this reality. This confrontation is terrifying to the weak self, which depends on constant social engagement to avoid the deeper questions. But, for the person determined to develop genuine power, solitude becomes a crucible in which the weak self is tempered and, ultimately, destroyed. The fifth form is the discipline of consistency. The weak self is, by nature, inconsistent. It wants what it wants in the moment: comfort, pleasure, escape, validation. It does not honor long-term commitments unless forced to do so. It is swayed by momentary impulses and rationalizes breaking its promises to itself. The powerful person, conversely, becomes a person of their word, first to themselves, then to others. They make a commitment and honor it not because they feel like it but because a person of power honors what they have said. This consistency in small matters, the habit formed despite lack of motivation, the truth told despite cost, the standard maintained despite pressure, is the slow, grinding demolition of the weak self. The weak self cannot survive in a person who has become reliable to themselves. It cannot maintain its grip on someone who has proven through hundreds of small acts that their word is law. The sixth form is the cultivation of strategic ruthlessness. Here we approach the Machiavellian heart of the matter. The destruction of the weak self sometimes requires actions that conflict with conventional morality or social niceness. It may require ending relationships that drain your energy and undermine your growth. It may require cutting off people you love because they cannot be trusted or are attempting to manipulate you. It may require refusing to help those who have made no effort to help themselves. It may require speaking unpopular truths. It may require making decisions that hurt others because those decisions are necessary. The weak self, shaped by social conditioning and the desire to be liked, recoils from this ruthlessness. It insists that such actions are cruel, selfish, and wrong. But, the powerful person has moved beyond the false morality that demands self-sacrifice and perpetual accommodation. They understand that genuine power requires the willingness to make decisions based on strategic necessity rather than sentiment. This does not mean becoming a genuinely cruel person for no purpose. It means developing the capacity to do what is necessary without emotional paralysis. It means understanding that sometimes the kindest act towards someone is to refuse to enable their weakness. It means recognizing that one's own growth and development may require distancing from those who cannot support it. It means being willing to disappoint people, to be perceived as selfish, to be disliked by those whose approval would be strategically advantageous but psychologically destructive. As these practices accumulate, the weak self undergoes genuine transformation. It does not disappear. Nothing in human nature can be completely eliminated. But it is subordinated. It becomes smaller, quieter, less influential in the decisions that shape a person's life. Its whispers are still heard, but they are recognized as whispers rather than truth. Its fears are still felt, but they no longer dictate action. Its pain is still experienced, but it no longer justifies capitulation. Part 3: The liberation of the reconstructed self and invulnerability through mastery. The culmination of this process is not the achievement of some permanent state of enlightenment or the eradication of all emotional pain. Rather, it is the establishment of a new relationship with oneself, a relationship characterized by sovereignty rather than subordination. The person who has destroyed their weak self is not a cold machine. They are paradoxically more fully human, more capable of genuine connection, more alive than they were before. But they possess a quality of freedom that was previously unavailable to them. This freedom manifests in multiple ways. First, it appears as freedom from fear of judgment. When a person has genuinely made themselves indifferent to the judgment of others, when they have decided that the opinions of strangers, acquaintances, and even loved ones do not have the power to diminish their sense of self-worth, they become functionally invulnerable to a primary tool through which the weak are controlled. Most of human social dynamics revolve around the fear of judgment and the attempt to manage how others perceive us. The person who no longer seeks approval becomes strange and somehow powerful to those around them. They cannot be manipulated through the withdrawal of approval because they do not require it. Second, this freedom appears as freedom from the paralysis of fear. Not freedom from feeling fear, fear is adaptive and useful, but freedom from being controlled by it. A person who has repeatedly walked through situations that frightened them and discovered that they survived discovers something profound. Fear is a sensation and a signal, not a verdict. They can feel afraid and act anyway. This ability multiplies their options in the world. What was previously closed to them becomes available. They can attempt difficult things not because they feel confident but because they have become comfortable with the sensation of fear itself. Third, this freedom appears as freedom from attachment to specific outcomes. The weak self desperately clings to particular results because it has constructed a narrative in which everything depends on achieving a specific goal or maintaining a specific situation. Lose the job, and identity crumbles. Lose the relationship, and the person becomes unworthy. Fail the project, and all previous accomplishments are negated. The reconstructed self, having survived failures and losses and rejections, becomes capable of persistent action without being destroyed by failure. This detachment paradoxically makes a person more effective. They can take bold action precisely because they are no longer desperate for a particular outcome. Fourth, this freedom appears as freedom from the exhaustion of maintaining a false self. The weak self is constantly running a program in the background, monitoring how it is being perceived, adjusting behavior to meet expectations, performing versions of itself designed to please various audiences, hiding aspects of itself that might be rejected, maintaining elaborate narratives about why it is worthy despite its secret doubts. This is emotionally and cognitively exhausting. The person who has destroyed the weak self and reconstructed themselves on the foundation of truth and self-acceptance no longer carries this burden. They are simply themselves, without apology, without constant calculation. But this new freedom brings with it a responsibility and a capacity that the weak self could never access, the ability to think and act in genuinely strategic ways. When a person is no longer at the mercy of their own emotional reactions, they become capable of what might be called strategic emotion. They can choose to express anger not because they feel angry but because expressing anger will produce a desired strategic effect. They can choose to appear vulnerable not because they feel weak but because strategic vulnerability will serve their purposes. They can choose to be kind not because they fear judgment but because kindness is strategically useful. This is the essence of Machiavellian sophistication, not cold calculation divorced from emotion but rather the mastery of emotion such that it becomes a tool rather than a master. The person operating from this level of development appears to others as having a strange kind of power. They are not necessarily charismatic in the conventional sense, though they often are. They are not necessarily physically imposing, though strength serves them. What they possess is an internal certainty and a freedom from the emotional desperation that marks most human interactions. This quality is almost hypnotic to others because most people have never encountered someone who was not seeking something from them, who was not vulnerable to manipulation, who was not trying to be liked or approved of or considered important. In professional contexts, this shows up as an unusual capacity for negotiation. The weak person enters a negotiation wanting to be liked, desperate to reach agreement, willing to accept less than they deserve. The powerful person enters the same negotiation willing to walk away. This willingness, born from the genuine indifference to outcomes that comes with internal security, is worth millions. They can be patient because they are not desperate. They can make demands because they do not need the other party's approval. They can walk away because their worth does not depend on completing this particular transaction. In personal relationships, this transformation shows up as a paradoxical increase in connection and decreased need for connection. When a person no longer needs others to validate their worth, they are free to connect with others from a position of abundance rather than need. They can love without clinging, support without enabling, and be honest without cruelty. They are no longer running the exhausting program of trying to be worthy of love, they understand that they are worthy simply by existing. This frees them to actually engage with others authentically rather than through the lens of their own insecurity. It also shows up as an increased capacity for solitude. The weak self cannot bear solitude because in solitude there is no distraction from the internal emptiness and doubt. But the person who has destroyed the weak self discovers that solitude is not a punishment but a gift. In solitude, one can think, create, and develop without the constant drain of managing others' expectations. Many of history's greatest achievements emerged from periods of deliberate solitude and withdrawal from social demands. The reconstructed self also develops what might be called strategic empathy. Because they are no longer consumed by their own emotional needs, they can see others clearly. They can understand what drives others, what makes them vulnerable, what they desire and fear. This understanding is not used for manipulation in the crude sense but for sophisticated influence. A person who understands that others are driven by the same weak selves that once controlled them can speak to those weak selves, can predict reactions, can navigate social complexity with a grace and effectiveness that mystifies those still trapped in emotional reactivity. This understanding brings a particular kind of power in leadership. The leader who operates from a foundation of reconstructed self does not require loyalty born of fear or love. They inspire it through the strange magnetism of someone who is genuinely indifferent to whether others follow them. They do not lead through manipulation or coercion because their followers recognize that they are being led by someone who is not using them, who does not need them, who has not made them responsible for their own worth. This kind of leadership is rare and devastating to those competing with it because it is difficult to counter. One cannot manipulate someone who cannot be moved by manipulation. One cannot threaten someone who is not afraid of loss. One cannot seduce someone who is not seeking validation. As time passes and this new relationship with self becomes habitual, the person develops something that might be called unshakable presence. They have weathered their own worst doubts and fears and discovered that they did not annihilate them. They have been rejected and learned that rejection is survivable. They have failed and learned that failure is not fatal. They have been alone and discovered that loneliness is a sensation that can be experienced without being destroyed by it. This experiential knowledge cannot be taken from them. No amount of external loss or criticism can shake it because it has been earned through direct encounter with the worst that they feared. This is the true Machiavellian advantage, not the willingness to be ruthless with others but the ruthlessness with oneself that produces genuine power. A person who has destroyed their weak self cannot be destroyed by others. The most sophisticated manipulation bounces off someone who does not require validation. The most severe criticism leaves unmoved someone who has transcended the need for approval. The most devastating loss affects someone differently when they have learned that their worth is not dependent on external circumstances. But, perhaps the deepest advantage is this: the person who has accomplished this transformation has achieved something approaching freedom. Not freedom in the utopian sense of being unaffected by circumstances or consequences, that would be folly. But freedom from the desperation that marks most human existence. Freedom from the constant anxiety of managing others' perceptions. Freedom from the despair that comes from basing one's worth on circumstances beyond one's control. Freedom from the endless craving for validation. Freedom from the paralysis of fear. This is a practical freedom, earthly and grounded, yet it transforms everything it touches. This is not a process that completes and, then, allows one to rest. The weak self, though subordinated, still exists. Complacency brings regression. The practice of discipline, of embracing discomfort, of maintaining consistency, of ruthless self-honesty must continue indefinitely. But, as these practices become habitual, they become lighter, less effortful. They transform from difficult discipline into simply the way one moves through the world. The final paradox is this: the person who has destroyed their weak self in order to achieve power discovers that the deepest power is not in dominion over others but in dominion over oneself. The person they have become is not separated from others by their superiority but connected to them through the strange recognition that comes when one person who has faced themselves truly encounters another person who is still running from themselves. There is compassion in this recognition, not sentimentality but genuine understanding born from memory of what it was like to be enslaved to one's own emotional reactions. The journey is long and the destination requires no arrival, only continued practice. But anyone who has walked this path even partially understands the truth at its core. To control one's emotions is to gain power over one's life. To destroy the weak self is to become the author of one's own story. And, to master oneself is to become effectively immune to the attempts of others to master you. This is the Machiavellian advantage, not virtue or vice but the freedom that comes from self-mastery, and, with that freedom comes a power that the weak can neither see nor comprehend.